to watch episode 1, Thunder. It's going to be a great time. We're going to follow up on our challenge from last week. Last week we challenged everybody to make a new connection and to seize the opportunity. Now, this morning we don't have quite so many new people as we did in the afternoons, evening, whatever. So that might have been slightly challenging to make a new connection. If you were like, well, I know everybody here, then that's fine. But if you seize the opportunity, then you can talk about that a little bit. Or if you're like, you know what, I showed up today and that's how I'm seizing the opportunity, you can talk about that. I'm going to give you approximately 3 to 4 minutes to do this. Ready? Go. So, before we watch our video, we are going to do a little bit of a recap of the lesson that is inside our spiral-bound workbook. If you'd like to follow along, you certainly may. We'll be starting around page 4 and then running through. Again, we're not going to read the lesson word for word. We're just going to hit some highlights, point out some things that were either different from the episode or things that we wanted to especially make a note of for you guys today. The first thing that we're going to talk about is sort of the section in the beginning and then the next section. First of all, we want to mention that John, the disciple, does refer to himself in his gospel as the disciple that Jesus loved. And in the episode, we have some hypothesizing about why John, in fact, referred to himself this way. The answer is simply we don't know why John referred to himself that way. The answer that Mother Mary gives in the episode is a possible answer. It's also possible, and you'll find out that answer in just a moment, it's also possible that John wanted to put the attention less on himself as like, this is me, and wanted to emphasize more his relationship to Jesus, and that was what was really important to him. We don't know. Also, anybody who has read through both Genesis 1 and John 1 will see marked similarities, and that's why we had you compare them in the text of our lesson. We don't know what prompted John to have his gospel start similarly to Genesis, but again, what is shown in the episode is a possible, not necessarily, it may be plausible, maybe not. There's nothing else in Scripture that gives us an indication of any meetings with Jesus or anything that would make the connection between, in John's mind, Genesis and what he decided to write at the beginning of his gospel. But we do know that Jesus and his disciples were together for 3 years, and we don't know all of the conversations that happened. We don't know all of the interactions that happened. So we would say that what is shown in this episode is possible, but there's no additional scriptural evidence for it. We do see strong parallelisms, parallel structure and parallel language between Genesis 1 and John 1, so the connection that we see formed in the video is possible. We also, in the episode, you're going to see John basically trying to gather eyewitness accounts early. And we know that John wrote his gospel on the island of Patmos many years later, in around the 90 AD, so this is about 60 years after Jesus has already died and risen again. But is it possible that he was collecting those eyewitness accounts sooner? Yeah, absolutely. There's no reason why he couldn't have or wouldn't have. In fact, it's very plausible that he would have. We also don't know what would have prompted him to do that. However, you're going to hear in the video mention, so that's sort of like okay, now we're several years into the future, and these are spoiler alerts. So, James the disciple, so brother of John, is martyred early. So he's martyred around 44 AD, and you're going to hear that mentioned in the episode, and it is very plausible that the early death of one of the disciples would have spurred the other disciples to say, oh my gosh, hey, we've got to think more seriously about the fact that we're not all going to be here for a long natural life. Maybe we need to start thinking more seriously about putting down these accounts so that whenever we're gone, others will still have our eyewitness accounts. So that's very possible, plausible. Again, nothing in Scripture that John says, I first started to collect this material whenever my brother James, nothing's in Scripture, but it is a plausible thing based on just natural, what we know from human psychology and from other historical accounts. Finally, they talk about logos as being the word. We put a decent chunk in your lesson about the relationship between the word logos and how it's been used in antiquity and both Greek literature and Hebrew literature, and its connection with the Hebrew idea of Sophia, which is the word for wisdom. These words are really deeply interconnected. I think it's especially cool that God as creator spoke and things came to be, and then John does use word as the thing that brings things to life as what he uses to describe Jesus. So it's just a really neat connection that we thought worth pointing out. Next, as you'll hear in the episode, we're going to be talking about not necessarily the Good Samaritan, but you're going to be talking about the road from Jerusalem to Jericho and sort of that journey. And in the area of Samaria in particular, it was fraught with robbers, and people would get beat up. And so that's one of the reasons why they would actually skirt the area and go sort of around it, because this was a dangerous road. You're going to hear it mentioned several times. Now, if you were with us for season 1, you will remember the history from episode 8, which is talking about the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. Jews and Samaritans didn't like each other for many reasons. Let's just briefly recap that so it's fresh in our heads for this episode. Remember, the nation of Israel was really only a single united nation under the first 3 kings. So we had Saul, only one in his dynasty, and then David and Solomon. Now, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, now these names, I'm going to check on the Middle East ones, give me grace. Rehoboam was not a good king, and he really put a burden on the people, and they ended up rebelling against him. Most of them, there were like 10 half tribes who decided, you know what, we don't want to serve you anymore, we're going to pick our own king. This guy's name was Jeroboam, not related to Rehoboam at all. Why are their names so similar? Because the Lord in heaven wanted to tax my brain. No. So, we have Jeroboam, who's ruling the northern kingdom of Israel, and that is how it's referred to now, the northern kingdom of Israel. So if you use the term Israel, after that point, Israel refers to the northern kingdom. And then the southern kingdom of Judah is basically the tribe of Judah, Benjamin, and then like the half-tribe of Manasseh or something like that. So, and then we have Levites who don't have any official territory that are sort of floating in between. So, we have the southern kingdom of Judah, who lasted longer, they were faithful to God longer than the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, if you guys remember from many times that we've gone over this, both in church and in our Bible studies, the northern kingdom of Israel is attacked and taken into captivity by which nation? I heard a few different answers. So the northern kingdom was taken into captivity by Assyria. The southern kingdom was taken into captivity by Babylon. So the Assyrians came in, and their particular method of keeping the captive nations subdued, under submission, was to basically supplant them, pick them up, and scatter them amongst other nations that they had conquered. So they would mix the people all over the place so that they would be separated from their hometowns, but then they would also be interacting with a whole bunch of people that they didn't have any connections with, and so that they didn't have a cohesive identity to be able to rise up and rebel against the nation of Assyria, which was clever. They worked pretty well. Now, the nation of Israel, again, northern tribes, did not heed God's commands to remain separate from the other nations, so they intermarried, lost a sense of their history, and ended up mixing their religion with the nations that they were planted into. And so throughout time, as sort of they continued to intermarry and they forgot who they were, in Jesus' day, some of the descendants of these people were in fact the Samaritans. And the Samaritans who had come back into this area whenever they had returned from exile, didn't necessarily know their lineage, so they couldn't necessarily trace it back, which was, remember, something that was very important to the Jews. They had mixed their religion with that of other nations, so they had some pagan worship sort of interspersed throughout their teachings. And they had decided that only the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, or the Pentateuch, were legit. So they were like the prophets, the Psalms, all of that stuff. They said, we don't consider that actual scripture. We are only going to use the first 5 books. They worshiped on a different mountain than Mount Sinai. They said, hey, Mount Gerizim over here, this one is great. We're going to use this one. And overall, they were looked down upon by the Jews, and then in return, the Samaritans were not very happy with the Jews either. And there have been some different skirmishes throughout history. You're going to hear them make mention of a couple of them in the video. All of that to say, there was a little bit of bad blood between the Jews and the Samaritans. They didn't like each other. And so, everything that's happening in the episode, whenever you're seeing some of these tensions arise, are very plausible. They're very plausible depictions of tensions that would have existed at that time between Jews and Samaritans, and it was definitely, a bit of a messy situation. Now, we are, like I said, not actually going to hear the story of the Good Samaritan in this episode, but it is alluded to in a very interesting way. So have your spidey senses on, get ready for it. There's going to be a very interesting connection that the creators of this episode made to this story. But I wanted to, again, just highlight that the point of the story of the Good Samaritan takes into consideration, though, that historical tension. And when Jesus presents the story of this Jew who's going along, he gets beat up by robbers, and then we have these 2 Jewish characters come along, the priest and the Levite, and these would have been people who the Jews said, hey, these are the people that we want to be listening to. These are the people that we admire. We want to emulate them. But they're the ones who pass him by and who do not stop and help. The person who the Jews would have said, oh no, they're scum of the earth, they're rotten, they're no good. The Samaritan was in fact the person who stopped and showed the man mercy. And Jesus' point in this whole story is, hey, if even the person that you think is the lowest of low can take the time to show mercy, well, how much greater is your responsibility to show everybody mercy? There's no limit on the people to whom you show mercy. Be a neighbor to everybody. So that's the point of Jesus' story there. Now, continuing to talk about the idea of Samaritans in the story, there are, of course, numerous fictional characters throughout the story. I won't stop every time we have a fictional character and say, now this character's not in Scripture, now this character's not in Scripture. But we do have a significant side character line of a dude named Melech, and he's not in Scripture. It is with this character that we have the fun connection with the Good Samaritan story. And again, if you haven't watched the episode yet, I will allow this part to be spoiler-free, and I will not share anything specific about it. But I would like to again say that although we don't have any specific stories about a guy like this in Scripture, it's plausible. It mirrors a lot of the other interactions that Jesus has with different people who are sick, who are hurting, and it mirrors the type of grace that he shows, where he doesn't avoid the truth, but he does it graciously with love and kindness, aiming not to just beat people up, but to draw them closer to him and to the truth. So we would say, again, it's not in Scripture, but it is plausible. Final sort of set of corrections here. In the episode, you're going to hear Jesus interacting with a crowd, and one of the members of the crowd is a shepherd, and you're going to hear the story about the parable of the lost sheep, where, okay, so if you have 99 sheep and one goes astray, what does the good shepherd do? Well, he leaves the 99 and he goes, finds it, and puts it on his shoulders, brings it home. That story is going to get pulled, again, from an interaction with a crowd member. And so there's this back and forth, Jesus with the crowd member, and there's this dialogue. And so then Jesus, from the dialogue, pulls out the moral of the story. Now, in Scripture, that's not how the story is presented. The parable is told in a set of three. We have the lost sheep, and then we have the lost coin, and then we have the lost son. And Luke presents this story in contrast with the Pharisees' grumbling attitude about Jesus, who had just been eating with tax collectors and sinners. And so Luke is making Luke frequently organizes things thematically rather than strictly chronologically. So it is possible that Jesus did in fact present these three parables right after the Pharisees were complaining about him. It's also possible that he did it at a later point and Luke is organizing the material to say, hey, these Pharisees over here, they are in fact like that hired hand who doesn't care about the sheep. And Jesus is the good shepherd who does love and care for the sheep. It is also possible that, again, it just happened in sequence. It's possible that Jesus originally had some conversation with some crowd member and then later retold the parable alongside a set of three others. We don't have anything in Scripture that shows that. It's just presented as a set of three parables all together, not in any context of a crowd, just there. So again, we don't see that it's there. Is it possible for it to have happened that way? It's possible, but there's nothing in Scripture that makes us think, oh yeah, that's definitely what happened. It's just a creative design that they chose to make, and there's nothing that we can say that, oh yeah, it definitely happened like that, or no, it definitely didn't happen like that. We do frequently see sometimes the authors of Scripture will take things and say, okay, this isn't necessarily a chronological telling, but I'm making a thematic point, or I want to emphasize Jesus' authority in this section, and I want to talk about his mercy in this section, and so sometimes things are woven together like that. So one way or the other, we can't make a strong point. We just want to highlight that it's not in Scripture. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy episode 1, Thunder.